Good evening all. In this video, we will be looking at the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, mostly by delving into history and philosophy relevant to the Marxist school of thought. Prior to this, we will be relaying key events from the lives of Marx and Engels that are relevant in the lead up to the publishing of the manifesto. Finally, we will end this video by discussing some general criticism of the manifesto, but also more broadly of Marxism and communism whilst avoiding arguments for capitalism. Without further ado, let me present to you a study of the Communist Manifesto. In 1815, the Napoleonic Wars would come to their true end at Waterloo. Millions are dead, and Europe was left devastated. The following year in the Rhine, a man by the name of Johann Caspar Engels would set up a food cooperative to provide cheap flour to his workers at his cotton mill business. The war caused food shortages, and the cooperative was set up to alleviate the hunger his workers were facing. It wasn't the first time that Johann Caspar would help his workers. In 1796, he would help his employees by finding them homes and establishing a school for his employees' children. He would pass away in 1821, passing on the business to his son Friedrich Engels Sr. Friedrich Engels Sr. recently became a father, giving birth to his son Friedrich Engels the year prior. His son, Engels, would become familiarized around businesses and was influenced by his grandfather and the way he treated his workers. He would spend much of his late teens and early adulthood investigating the other cotton mills in his area, the Wupper Valley. There, he would witness the other workers suffer greatly. Their backs were constantly bent, syphilis was rampant, and child labour was utilised. In 1842, he would write regularly for a newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung, where he would ridicule these factories that had abhorrent workers' conditions. In 1843, Rheinische Zeitung got more radical, and would consequently get censored in Prussia. In 1844, whilst at a cafe in Paris, he would happen to meet a man by the name of Karl Marx. The thing was, both men were communists, and after a good discussion, the two would find that they were on the same page on a lot of issues. Karl Marx was born in 1819 to Jewish parents Herschel and Henriette Marx. Herschel was a lawyer but struggled to get employed due to his faith. You see, the Rhine was, and still is, very much a strongly Catholic region of Germany, and because of this, anti-Semitism was rife. As a consequence of this, Herschel would convert to Protestantism, more specifically, Pietism, to be able to work, resulting in him changing his name to Heinrich. He did this because he had an interest in philosophy, most notably the works of Voltaire and Rousseau. Heinrich would have 9 children, of which only 5 would survive as the other 4 would pass from tuberculosis. Karl Marx would end up as the eldest son of the family and attend Frederick William High School in Trier. He was an above-average student who made no lasting relationships, possibly due to the fact that 80% of the attending students were Catholics. He would graduate around 17 years old, as at that age he would also leave to study at the University of Bonn. Before he would leave, he would propose to his childhood sweetheart Jenny von Westphalen, a woman who was 4 years older than him and from an aristocratic lineage. She would say yes, and be committed for the rest of her life to the emancipation of the proletariat alongside her husband. By the end of the first year of his degree, Marx had burnt himself out from overworking. This meant that he performed well in the first semester, but poorly in the second. In addition to this, when Marx wasn't studying, he would spend his free time at the University Tavern Club. It was basically a society where students would get drunk and get into fights, which Marx did quite often. This overall culminated into Marx sending fewer letters home to his family and spending too much money, a character flaw of Marx. His father was, to say the least, not impressed. He could only just about afford to pay off his debts, and was angered by Marx's lack of communication. As a consequence, Marx's father would send him to the University of Berlin to continue his studies there. At Berlin, the faculty within Marx's chosen degree were heavily influenced by Hegelianism, an idealist philosophy formulated by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a German philosopher who passed around the time Marx started high school and taught at Berlin. But what is Hegelianism? Hegel put forth the idea that humans understand the universe through a process of a thesis and antithesis, known as the Hegelian dialectic. Once the thesis and antithesis clash, they come to a result creating a synthesis. Let's use a real example. The workers at a business are striking because of poor working conditions. The owners of the business react by improving working conditions in some way. The workers' quality of life is improved. The agenda, the broad thing that will be changed in some way by the synthesis, is the quality of life of the workers. The thesis, the problem that the agenda faces, is, in this example, the poor working conditions the workers are having to deal with. The antithesis, the reaction to the poor working conditions, is to strike. The synthesis is improving the working conditions, which in turn improves the quality of the life of the workers. Now use this thought process to anything you can imagine. Let's apply this to a real-life example and play around with the agenda and synthesis. Across the UK in 2023, public sector workers such as people working in the rail, education and health sector have been striking due to what can be summarised as poor working conditions. What syntheses can we conjure up from the situation by changing the agenda? We could say that the strikes have worsened public perception of the Conservative Party due to the pay cuts caused by austerity measures that have not been adequately addressed. In addition to this, we could also add theses, antitheses, and syntheses to this particular agenda. Another thesis could be the needless deaths caused by COVID-19 complications, and another antithesis could be poor Conservative Party polling. This still leads to poor public perception of the Conservative Party, but could also be a reduced likelihood of the Conservative Party winning the next general election. Overall, I've rewritten this section way too many times to hope anyone gets what I mean, because even I don't fully understand it, but this is my attempt at teaching philosophy. Let me know how I did. After Hegel passed, his followers over time would split into two groups, the leftist and rightist Hegels. Rightist, or old Hegelians, took a more conservative turn. They believed that using pious Christianity, Hegel's philosophy represented a conclusion in humanity's progress as a species. Prussia had reached a peak socially, and there were no more theses or antitheses to discuss. All syntheses had been reached. However, the leftist or young Hegelians took a secularist approach. They believed that in order to be faithful to Hegel, they would have to agree that Prussia, and people in general, were far from reaching their final state. More of these syntheses will be reached with time. Some of these thinkers from the young Hegelian group would go on to inspire other forms of philosophy such as anarchism, nihilism, and, relevant to us, Marxism. Marx would gradually accept Hegelianism, initially being skeptical due to following a Kantian philosophy. Due to this, he would join the Doctors' Club, a society of young Hegelians who shared their Hegelian views and where Marx would grasp his own philosophy better. After graduating, Marx returned to Bonn and established himself so that he could join the Cologne Circle, a group of young Hegelian communists who would later establish the Rheinische Zeitung newspaper. Marx would write for this increasingly radical newspaper in the early 1840s, during a time when he worked on his doctorate and contracted tuberculosis in 1841. Marx would be asked to make a change in scenery by his doctor and headed up north to a village. During his recovery, his thoughts would become more radical. When he finally recovered, he would continue writing for Rheinische Zeitung and begin earning a living to support himself and his wife Jenny. These two factors came at a more serious cost down the line. In November 1843, the Rheinische Zeitung would become censored by Prussian authorities due to its critical attitude towards religion and the status quo. Marx would, around this time, move to Paris and simultaneously meet Engels in 1844. The two had actually written for the same newspaper but never properly met. Due to the censorship of the Rheinische Zeitung, Marx stopped earning money, and as a consequence, was broke. Had it not been for Engels and his wealthy background, Marx's works such as the Communist Manifesto and Capital may have never been published. The following year, Prussian authorities decided Marx's extradition back to Prussia. Marx would then be exiled from France and moved to Brussels in 1845, only to be later exiled from Brussels later too and moved to London. During his time in Paris, however, he and Engels would become known within the League of the Just, a radical German socialist group that was based in Paris and London, but would later be primarily based in London and also rename itself to the Communist League. Meetings would be held in 1846 and early 1847, but Marx could not attend due to a lack of funds. In late 1847, he would finally attend a meeting where he would find himself defending his new theory of communism to the members of the League. This debate would go on for 10 days and would result in Engels and Marx being tasked with writing a manifesto for the League. The two would work on 3 drafts over the next few months, with the final version being finished in January 1848, and then the manifesto being officially published in London in February 1848. The period between Marx first attending Berlin and the publishing of the manifesto is quite condensed. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff to read about Marx in McClellan's book that is free to read, such as Marx getting into a disagreement with Proudhon, the father of anarchism, one of the drafts for the manifesto being written by Moses Hess, another fellow communist, and Marx's own but failed journal called the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuche that he attempted to start up after Rheinische Zeitung was banned. The introduction of the Communist Manifesto begins with the infamous "A spectre is haunting Europe," the spectre of communism. Up until the Communist League and Marx's manifesto, no power had taken to call themselves communist. Yet all European powers must acknowledge the existence of communism due to the Holy Alliance, an alliance between Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and Russia as a response to the Napoleonic Wars to prevent any democratic or revolutionary ideas from lifting off in those countries. Marx then acknowledges the revolutionary anti-monarchy hegemonic ideas spread by Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars, and ends it by trying to motivate other communists to publish their views. In society, there has always been 2 broad classes, an oppressor and oppressed class. This has meant that society has always faced class struggle. With the end of feudalism, a hierarchical and oppressive system, complex societal arrangements dependent on social status arose. This, however, did not mean that with these new arrangements, that these class antagonisms have been done away with. While complex societal arrangements exist, we can still organize all the different classes into new classes or divisions, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, according to Marx, derived from the serfs in the Middle Ages who became chartered burghers of the earliest towns. What this means is that serfs who moved to towns were free and not part of the oppressive feudal system. There are two ways this class spreads its oppression. The first is through colonization of new lands to expand their wealth. Marx cites Columbus's discovery of America. They accomplish this through what can be effectively interpreted as imperialism, and making these newly acquired lands adopt a capitalist mode of production and creating a bourgeoisie in that new land. It creates a world after its own image. The other way the bourgeoisie oppresses the proletariat is by industrializing. You see, prior to the era of the Industrial Revolution, feudal societies were rural and agrarian in nature. Peasants/serfs who worked for their guildmasters, or knights, mostly worked on farms or did labour that we today consider to be part of the primary sector. Societies in Europe had existed under this hegemony for centuries, but humans are always developing new technologies, and what the oppressors of feudal societies did not foresee were technological advancements that would create new, unforeseen markets. These markets grew to the point that it promoted urbanization and industrialization, and if you possessed the capacity to do so, you would start a business that would get you a good foothold in one of these new growing markets, rather than sitting and slaving away in the fields. These markets got bigger and bigger, and before you knew it, you were living in the era of the Industrial Revolution. Those raw materials that your forefathers before you spent their entire lives collecting for some bloke who would stab you if you didn't, well, now you were using those raw materials to make lots of different stuff. This is secondary sector work, or factory work. Sure, you had professions such as blacksmiths before, but now it was on a scale so large that there was a significantly higher demand for human labour to make stuff rather than extract stuff. Urbanization would then take place so that the workers and services could be closer to one another, and so that you, as a worker, could get to work more easily. During the Industrial Revolution, technology developed even faster. The bourgeoisie were teaching one another how to create better technologies and systems of production, with the introduction of steam and machinery, and all the while the bourgeoisie, who had emancipated themselves and others, now became the very thing they sought to run away from, and during the entire time became richer and richer. Their wealth increased with globalization. With advancements in transport, the markets were not enclosed within your country's border. You could sell offshore and set up markets there too, and even make more money. This, whilst all nice and warm on paper, has its downsides that you may have already figured up to this point. But Marx chooses to point out that this system gives the bourgeoisie a political sway because they own a lot of capital. The state becomes a manager of businesses. This can be interpreted in two ways. One, that the purpose of the state and its legislation is to make sure that businesses don't go full anarcho-capitalist, or two, that businesses affect the politics and legislation of a society. Another effect of capitalism that Marx points out is that the character and personal value of jobs and roles in society have been lost in the name of money. A doctor used to work for the knights, lords and monarchy and be respected for their profession, but with the introduction of money, doctors have been reduced to nothing more than just labourers for the bourgeoisie, who are paid by the bourgeoisie. The same applies to the family. So why haven't the proletariats risen up and overthrown the bourgeoisie? Because the bourgeoisie creates societal conditions, a hegemony that is never really disturbed, and within those societal conditions, creates an everlasting uncertainty about those conditions. However, this very same hegemonic rule will lead to the eventual downfall of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat, according to Marx, are chained up by the bourgeoisie, and overproduce in an extremely urbanized society, and the bourgeoisie knows this. They overcome this issue by either causing mass unemployment, moving their businesses elsewhere, or by more thoroughly exploiting the existing markets. There is only one depressing purpose of the proletariat, and that's to increase the bourgeoisie's wealth or capital. This isn't aided by the fact that the type of work the proletariat do is simple, monotonous, and lacks any charm. The proletarian has just become an appendage of the machine. In addition to this, the more arduous the job and the more machines that are involved in that job, the worse it got paid in Marx's time. He complements this by saying that the easier the job, women and children will replace the male workforce that do that job. Marx interestingly describes the workforce of an industrial job like an army. The owner is the patriarchal master that hires a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. The workers who commit the labour are the soldiers that are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. With the bourgeoisie's capital expanding, it increases wealth inequality, meaning that the richest own more and more wealth whilst more of the poorest percentile need to be included to match that wealth. Another reason the proletariat hasn't come together to overthrow the bourgeoisie is because the proletariat aren't fighting the bourgeoisie. Instead, they fight the enemies of their enemy, the absolute monarchy, the landowners, the petty bourgeoisie. A final reason the proletariat haven't overthrown the bourgeoisie is because the proletariat are a scattered mess, competing against the bourgeoisie on their own terms. However, this lack of interconnectedness, such as in Marx's time, may be mitigated with more interlinking inventions such as that of the rail, that can assist in centralizing trade unions. Even though they may merely slow down the bourgeoisie by destroying machinery in protest or competing against one another, over time the proletariat will grow and improve wages and work conditions and grow stronger as a unified force. One example that Marx lists as an accomplishment of the proletariat in the UK, for example, is the introduction of the 10 hours bill that prevented women and children from working more than 10 hours a day at textile mills. The proletariat aren't the only ones fighting though. The bourgeoisie also fights, and while it has already been established that the bourgeoisie fights to expand its capital via globalization and colonialism, the bourgeoisie has forced the aristocracy of its country to become the new oppressive class, and then against other bourgeoisie who are against industrial progress or from foreign nations. With the proletariat shackled, the bourgeoisie utilize the prisoners to fight other bourgeoisie who fall out of line of the whole "I need to keep getting richer" ethos. They do this by teaching the proletariat via general education. When the revolution will eventually occur, the class dynamic will shift from oppressor and oppressed to the ruling and revolutionary class. Some members of the oppressor or ruling class will join the other side, and these are the intellectuals. The proletariat has and always will be the face of the revolutionary class because, unlike other revolutionary classes, the proletariat is a majority class and has not fizzled out quickly because of this fact. Other revolutionary classes did not make up a majority and as a consequence disappeared. Now, Marx made an unusual point about the proletariat destroying equipment and machinery as a protest to bourgeois rule. There's a specific reason for this, and this is because the proletariat lack any national character, and usually lack ownership of property. The family is irrelevant. Whatever sort of labour they are able to carry out, whatever laws do and don't protect or apply to them, whatever morals and religious values they hold, are merely something the bourgeoisie uses to prejudice them, and utilise as a means to an end. It is more so a frustration than anything else. The final and most compelling reason the bourgeoisie will fall to the proletariat is due to the incompatibility of capitalism as a whole. The dynamic between capital, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat is flawed. The bourgeoisie's main aim is to get more capital, so they utilise the labour of the proletariat to do this and exploit them by rewarding a minimal amount of the profit the bourgeoisie has generated to keep the proletariat satisfied. The proletariat usually struggles to live off this money, and as a consequence, instead of the bourgeoisie utilising the force that is the proletariat to feed its desire for capital through more oppressive means, what imagined to be slavery, the bourgeoisie has to feed the proletariat. As we established earlier, the bourgeoisie is the oppressor and the proletariat are the oppressed class. If the bourgeoisie were to be a truly oppressive class that is constantly fed capital by the oppressed, the bourgeoisie should not do vice versa. The bourgeoisie is effectively a bad oppressor. This creates cracks that the proletariat, a majority class, can exploit when eventually revolting against the bourgeoisie. As aforementioned, once again, the proletariat are split, but improved transportation is bringing them closer together. Competition is a double-edged sword. Whilst it increases bourgeois capital, it also improves the technology the proletariat will use to overthrow the bourgeoisie, and also bring them closer as industry urbanizes. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Marx establishes the relationship between communists and proletarians. He does this in 4 bullet points. Communists do not create opposing parties to workers' parties. Communists have the best interests of the proletariat and never opposing ones. Communists do not promote a principle that puts people into 2 groups. Communists distinguish themselves from other working class parties by the different national struggles of different proletariat movements, but hold the common interests of the proletarians irregardless of nationality. They represent the interests of the whole movement regardless of the stages at which the proletariat are with their bourgeoisie. Property relations are based on history. People through history find property and claim it as theirs. Whilst both the proletariat and bourgeoisie own property, the bourgeoisie owns a disproportionate amount of that property. This is achieved through 2 means. The first, through the labour of the proletariat. Because the proletariat generates capital for the bourgeoisie in turn buys property from the proletariat. The other means links to the first, in that the now newly acquired property will now be used to expand the industry or means that the bourgeoisie generates capital. Communism seeks to eliminate bourgeois property because it finalises a society based on class antagonisms. It is the exploitation of the many by the few, based on the antagonism of capital and wage labour. Capital, if we see it as a social construction, is a social power that only holds power if we deem it to be a power. Capital is converted into personal property, not social property. Only the class character or the class of which that property belongs to changes. The minimum wage is exploitative. As Marx describes it, it only provides enough for the labourer to exist, with its real purpose seeking to increase capital for the bourgeoisie and for the labourer to live at the command of them. Communism would seek to stop this, to not make it appropriate for the proletariat to exist to increase capital for the bourgeoisie, and to promote and enrich the existence of the labourer. Currently, the labourer relies on the bourgeoisie to exist, and the capital they own. This is because personal property is converted from capital, and the bourgeoisie gets all this capital. Character derives from the ownership of personal property, so it is necessary for the bourgeoisie to deprive the proletariat of their character, as otherwise, it would mean that not only is the bourgeoisie not exploiting the proletariat enough, but it gives room for the proletariat to free themselves from the bourgeoisie. Communism would seek to end this, power to subjugate the labour of others by means of appropriation. The current dynamic is that those who work get nothing, whilst those who do not work get everything. Marx also discusses several other things that communism under his vision would also affect. The family under the bourgeoisie only exists for private and capital gain, and communism would abolish this to stop the exploitation of children and the property-like treatment of women in these families. Education would also need to stop being influenced by the bourgeoisie. Marx desires the abolition of countries and nationalities as the working men have no country. National differences are disappearing due to the uniformity of secondary labour, and as aforementioned, this labour is becoming more common due to urbanisation and industrialisation. Just like class, however, national differences would need to go to prevent the exploitation of one country by the other. Religion, morality, and philosophy would also need to be abolished to contradict history and prevent the development of class antagonisms. On page 20 of the manifesto, Marx lays out the 10 planks of communism. The planks are as follows. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, abolition of all right to inheritance, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan, equal obligation of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equable distribution of the population of the country, and free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labour in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. So what does this all mean in English? Property should not be a commodity and should be shared amongst everyone. The richer you are, the more you should be taxed, and vice versa. This would be possible in most modern societies if tax havens didn't exist. Self-explanatory. No one can inherit, so that people aren't born rich or rich through old money. Those who have migrated and no longer live in their country should not have their property, and neither should those that rebel against the new order. This point refers to the propping up of central banks, which control the amount of money in circulation and inflation. About 10 or so countries today do not have centralized banks. The state can control how you communicate and travel. The expansion of factories and the means under which people work. Marx also states that land that is no longer usable is to be improved over time through the improvement of the soil. Everyone has to work. Industrial armies are defined as those who are unable to find work because there are no available jobs. These are people who are prepared to fill in for those who suddenly can't work or because new jobs have propped up. The agricultural and manufacturing sectors should come under one roof. People should populate countries equally, leading to the lack of a need for the terms urban and rural. Public schools should offer free education to children and they shouldn't work. Children should be educated on how to work in factories. Today, this would be known as vocational training. Once class distinctions are eliminated and people lack any political power, as that is a method of oppression, the proletariat become the ruling class, and by proxy, every other class disappears. With the proletariat as the only class, the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all. The following are different types of socialism Marx has observed. Feudal socialism advocated for a socialism where the aristocracy joins the proletariat in an attempt to overthrow the bourgeoisie and continue to exist in a socialist utopia whilst conceding their interests. If it sounds dumb, it's because it is dumb. In order for a socialist revolution to even happen, the aristocracy is required to be overthrown by the bourgeoisie, and then for the bourgeoisie to be overthrown by the proletariat. The aristocracy should be long and gone, and for the proletariat to even side with it is out of the question. Marx emphasizes this by stating that when the proletariat noticed the moment that they were attempting to be won over by the monarchy, they just laughed. Christian socialism is also out of the question due to the divine nature of a monarchy that would merely pardon its oppressive actions. Whilst briefly aforementioned, Marx leaves an entire section to talk about a class in society that does not fit in either the revolutionary or ruling class. They are merely an outlier class, and these are the petty bourgeoisie. They are a class that fluctuate between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and are at constant threat of being absorbed into the proletariat by bourgeois competition and the continually growing bourgeois capital. The result of giving most of the capital to the few would lead to overproduction and crises, according to some Swiss economist. The same economist states that the increasing wealth gap would lead to ruin of the petty bourgeois, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy in production, the crying inequalities of wealth, industrial war of extermination between nations, dissolution of old moral bonds, of old family relations, of the old nationalities, basically hell on earth. The petty bourgeois socialist solution was, however, unorthodox. They basically believed that the best form of socialism was one that resembled the feudal system, minus the oppression, and therefore fell apart quickly. German socialism is socialism that German philosophers try to apply to Germany whilst taking literature from French socialists. There's many problems with this. The first issue being that, as Marx has aforementioned, you cannot just copy another country's means to overthrow the bourgeoisie to another. Each case is unique. The other issue is that these particular philosophers were trying to overthrow the bourgeoisie during a feudal Germany, preventing the bourgeoisie from toppling the aristocracy, acting as a scarecrow that prevented Germany from becoming socialist without realizing it. It also aided the petty bourgeoisie that was against liberalism. Marx mostly uses this section to criticize these philosophers who annoy him when he reads German socialist literature. This socialism doesn't even sound like socialism to me at least, but more like right-wing social democracy. Effectively, this is a socialism where class divisions continue to exist, meaning there is still a bourgeoisie and a proletariat, but the bourgeoisie benefits the working class rather than exploits them. The bourgeoisie surrenders some of the power it has over the proletariat so that they can continue to exist without facing any dangers. The concessions they make can vary from prison reform to free trade. People who subscribe to this socialism tend to call out economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, people who improve conditions for the working class, organisers of charity, animal cruelty prevention members, teetotal fanatics and bureaucrats. He cites Proudhon, the person Marx squabbled with earlier, and his famous work Philosophie de la Misère as an example of this socialism. This is socialist literature that came from feudal times. Essentially, these are some of the earliest socialists, citing minds such as Owen, Fourier, and Saint-Simon and their systems. These thinkers saw a shackled proletariat, but there was no bourgeoisie present yet to create the conditions required to free the proletariat. So, these thinkers went out and sought a new science and social laws that would create those conditions. The problem with this literature is that the proletariat are only the oppressed class, in their view, when they are the most oppressed class. Otherwise, they are not a class. The other issue is that these thinkers also believed that socialism could be obtained through peaceful means at this time, which was just impossible because the proletariat were not even a class in feudal times. Finally, the people that subscribe to this thought are problematic as they violently oppose political action by the working class and simply strengthen class antagonisms. Communists work alongside existing parties like the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in the US. Communists want immediate aims to aid the interests of the working class and take care of the future of the communist movement. In France, in Marx's time, the communists are allied by the Social Democrats to fight their bourgeoisie. The Swiss support the radicals, the Polish support an agrarian revolution to free the proletariat. The Germans fight alongside members of the bourgeoisie that are fighting the feudal system but will effectively backstab them once a capitalist system is in place to achieve socialism by using their figurative weapons. Germany is of particular interest because a bourgeois revolution is about to take place, and this was correct as a rebellion occurred in Germany the same year the manifesto was published. Marx reiterates that communists support every revolutionary movement against the status quo of a country. They labour everywhere for democratic parties, they're open to revolution, and to end neatly, Marx poetically ends with, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite!" Since Marx's time, there have been over 26 socialist/communist countries, with 5 still standing today and the rest returning to a capitalist-based economy. To say that the Communist Manifesto and Marxism has had an influence on the world would be an understatement, but this doesn't come without criticism. The biggest criticism of the manifesto can be easily summarized as, "Where the revolution at?" As Marx has said, once a society moved on from feudalism and on to capitalism, the proletariat would rise up and overthrow their bourgeoisie, ushering in a socialist society that would begin its transition to communism. Yet, this hasn't happened for most countries. Most countries achieved capitalism and have remained capitalist. So what's going on? The revolutionary aspect has caused social democrats and democratic socialists to be critical of the manifesto. This is because they believe socialism can be achieved in multiple ways, and not just by revolution. Levitsky and Way criticize revolutions in general, finding that they tend to lead to authoritarian regimes. Pereira writes that socialist societies, according to Marx, transition into communist societies. This has not been true for most socialist/communist societies, as many have actually detransitioned to capitalist economies. One could even argue that modern communist countries such as China are not even communist, as they do not fall under Marx's description of a communist or socialist society. One could go a step further and argue that no country that has called itself socialist or communist was truly that, and that they instead were countries that attempted to reach that goal. However, this argument can be made about any society, even democratic ones, as no country has been absolutely democratic. Communist countries throughout history have also been notorious for providing their citizens limited rights. Freedom of speech, political expression, and discrimination towards religious groups was evident in communist countries such as the USSR. Pereira also criticizes Marx for heavily relying on historicism and explaining things as products of economic forces. Historicism is explaining the existence of social and cultural practices through studying their history. Things exist because of past events. A critic of historicism, philosopher Karl Popper, argues three faults of historicism. 1. That describing a whole society is impossible because the characteristics of a society are endless. Because we cannot describe every nook and cranny of society, we cannot predict the future of that society. 2. Human history is a single unique event. The past will not necessarily predict the future. Processes are unique and therefore are not bound to laws that they have to follow. 3. You can never predict individual human action or nature, and any attempt to control it completely will lead to tyranny. Therefore, historicists often require mankind to be remodeled to be fit for a future society and speed up the process of the arrival of this society. An historicist cannot predict what will happen in a society that stops following a trend. There are other criticisms present in the sources used, but a lot of them are a defense of capitalism and a criticism of Marx's labour theory of value. If you're interested in reading about this stuff, sources are in the description, and I recommend as further reading to read Marx's Das Kapital. It's a long piece of work, but it goes into more depth regarding capitalism than this video ever could reach. To conclude, the Communist Manifesto is a brief outline of Marxist thought. It came at a time where the average worker worked in horrid conditions, where capitalism was beginning to envelop the world. The manifesto itself begins by interpreting society as a battle between two classes, an oppressor and oppressed class. Society has always faced class struggle, ever since feudal times. In a capitalist society, however, this has now become more pronounced. The oppressor and oppressed classes no longer consist of several classes, but just one class for each. The oppressor, the bourgeoisie, is a small group within society with a large amount of capital. They are the force under capitalism that has massively sped up urbanization, industrialization, globalization, and colonialism. They have urbanized areas as a response to rapid industrialization. They sell their goods abroad through globalization due to colonialism. Their only goal in life is to generate as much wealth as possible. The proletariat are the exploited and oppressed class. The amount of wealth and time away from the tools and machines they need to use at their jobs is decreasing. They have become nothing more than a class that is used to provide the bourgeoisie with capital, whilst being nothing but exploited in return. This, however, is the exact reason the bourgeoisie will fall. The bourgeoisie should be fed by the proletariat, but because the proletariat sink deeper and deeper into poverty, they get to a state where they do not earn enough to live, and the bourgeoisie has to feed it instead. The bourgeoisie should be literally enslaving the proletariat, because the proletariat is a revolutionary class that will not cease to exist unlike former revolutionary classes. The bourgeoisie, by keeping the proletariat just about out of absolute poverty, feeds a class that will topple it over and usher in socialism, the theoretical period between capitalism and communism. A communist society is characterized as a classless one, where there are no classes that can antagonize other ones, no means to discriminate via nationality, and where people produce enough to sustain themselves. A proletariat revolution has not yet been achieved, at least in the 19th century, because the proletariat are a scattered, disconnected mess. With better infrastructure, this will make it easier for proletarians around the world to come together and overthrow their individual bourgeoisie to establish a new world order. And yet, we've been waiting for 175 years.